a deformed body, an unbearable stench, a smell so nauseating it made courtiers faint. After his death, fluids leaked from the coffin and were licked by stray dogs. This was the horrible end of one of the most feared monarchs in history. Today we tell you the true story of the death of Henry VIII of England, a story so grotesque it must be told in its whole repugnant reality. Henry VIII was born on June 28, 1491. When he ascended the throne at 18, he was considered the most handsome prince in Europe. Tall, athletic, with golden hair and a commanding presence. A Venetian ambassador wrote that he had an extraordinary physique and an angelic face superior in beauty to any other Christian sovereign. How could this example of youth and power ever end up suffering such a degrading death? The turning point was an incident that occurred in January 1536 during a jousting tournament in Greenwich. At 44, Henry fell from his horse when the animal fell on top of him. The king was left unconscious for 2 hours. Despite surviving, the wound to his right leg never completely healed. This wound turned into an ulcer that constantly emanated an unpleasant smell that announced his presence before he entered a room. It was a profound humiliation for such a vain king. The courtiers were forced to endure the smell without showing any disgust, upon pain of royal displeasure. The incident also marked the beginning of a transformation in his behavior. Whether coincidence or not, it happened at the same time Henry ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, with the fabricated accusation of adultery and treason. Some historians hypothesize that the brain injury resulting from the fall may have exacerbated pre-existing tendencies toward paranoia and fits of rage. With reduced mobility, the king began to gain weight rapidly. His waist, which in his youth measured 89 centimeters, expanded to exceed 130 centimeters. His weight exceeded 180 kilograms, making him so obese that he had to be moved between royal palaces through a specially designed chair. The doorways of the palaces had to be enlarged to allow him to pass. The royal diet contributed enormously to his decline. Kitchen records show that Henry consumed about 5,000 calories a day, mainly from red meats with very few vegetables. A typical dinner included different types of meat, pastries, and impressive quantities of wine and beer. This regime, combined with inactivity, accelerated his physical deterioration. The ulcers on his legs worsened over time. Doctors applied treatments that now we know are harmful. Cauterization with hot irons, application of mixtures containing arsenic and mercury, and regular bloodletting that did nothing but weaken him further. The wounds became so serious that bones were visible through the decomposing flesh. The smell was so nauseating that his presence could be detected from 3 rooms away. At 49, Henry married Catherine Howard, a young woman of only 19 years. He saw this marriage as a return to youth. However, the age difference, combined with his deteriorated condition, made that union grotesque. Catherine, unable to stand her deformed and unhealthy husband, sought comfort in the arms of a young courtier. When the relationship was discovered, the king ordered the execution of both. His last marriage with Catherine Parr in 1543 was more political than romantic. Catherine assumed more the role of nurse than wife, caring for the dying king with surprising dedication, considering the fate of her predecessors. In his last years, Henry suffered from multiple pathologies. Modern doctors believe he probably suffered from diabetes, gout, hypertension, and kidney failure. Some believe he had syphilis, although this diagnosis has been contested by many modern historians. This combination of diseases transformed his last years into continuous agony. The accounts of the time describe how the king alternated periods of unbearable pain during which he yelled and cursed all those who surrounded him, with moments of deep lethargy during which he remained motionless for hours. Henry's paranoia intensified with his physical deterioration. The once brilliant statesman became obsessed with imaginary conspiracies, executing friends and loyalists on the basis of unfounded accusations. Terror dominated the court, as an imprudent word or a misinterpreted gesture could mean a charge of treason. In particular, he ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, just 9 days before his own death. His fear of being poisoned became an obsession. He implemented a well-developed food security protocol that required servants to taste every dish before it reached his table. All utensils were meticulously inspected. This fixation could have been a symptom of his growing mental instability or the result of small, recurrent strokes. With the approach of the end, Henry's suffering reached almost unimaginable levels. In his last months, he was barely able to move, even with help. The gangrene spread in his legs, intensifying the already unbearable stench. The royal court became a place of whispers and murmurs, with courtiers covering their noses with scented handkerchiefs, forcing themselves to remain in the presence of the king. During his last winter, between 1546 and 1547, the king's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from recurring fevers, probably due to sepsis and numerous infections throughout his body. Breathing became increasingly difficult, and episodes of delirium became frequent. Witnesses reported the king murmuring the names of his late wives, particularly Jane Seymour, who died after giving birth to his only legitimate son, and perhaps Anne Boleyn, whose ghost, it was said, tormented him. Interestingly, despite his clearly terminal condition, no courtier dared to suggest that the king was dying. English law considered it treason to predict the death of the monarch, so doctors and courtiers continued to insist that his recovery was possible even when the smell of decomposition emanated from his still living body. On January 27, 1547, realizing that his end was near, Henry finally allowed Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to be called to his chamber. Unable to speak, he clasped Cranmer's hand when asked if he died in Christian faith. This was his last conscious gesture. In the early hours of January 28th, at the age of 55, the king had a powerful seizure and exhaled his last breath. But the humiliation of his condition did not end with death. Because of his enormous dimensions, it was necessary to construct a special coffin to contain his remains. Preparing the body for the funeral was a horrible task for the embalmers. The process of embalming at the time was rudimentary and mainly involved removing the organs and filling the cavities with aromatic herbs. In the following days, while the body lay in state awaiting the funeral, one of the most macabre episodes associated with Henry's death occurred. The coffin, sealed inadequately to contain the gases and fluids of decomposition, began to leak as it rested in the chapel at Sion. During the night, accounts describe a disturbing scene. The corpse released liquid that spilled onto the chapel floor, where it was discovered by stray dogs that licked the rotten substance. This story, reported by chroniclers of the time, represents a profoundly humiliating end for a king who had built his image around power, majesty, and divine authority. The powerful Henry, who had defied the Pope, redefined the English church and sent 2 wives to the scaffold, had finally become a mass of rotting flesh. His body was defiled by stray dogs. The funeral was finally held on February 16th, 1547, almost 3 weeks after his death. Despite the unbearable stench emanating from the coffin, the ceremonies were conducted with all the pomp expected from such a monarch. He was buried in the chapel of St. George in Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him his longed-for male heir, Edward VI. By irony of fate, Edward, whose existence had motivated many of Henry's controversial decisions, including the break with Rome, ruled only for 6 years before dying of illness at 15 years old. The throne then passed to Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who tried to reverse the Protestant reforms of her father, and finally to Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who would inaugurate a golden age in English history. The grotesque death of Henry VIII serves as a powerful reminder of the limits of human power. The king, who was considered above the law, capable of redefining the national religion and ending human lives at his whim, was in the end the victim of his own mortal condition. His death was not only the end of a man, but the symbol of the decline of an era. The English historian Alison Weir wrote, "It is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who at the beginning was so promising, handsome, and capable ended up as a grotesque caricature of himself. Tormented by physical pain and mental instability, feared and adored by those around him, but rarely truly loved. The transformation of Henry VIII from ideal prince to an obese and ill tyrant remains one of the most fascinating examples of how absolute power combined with chronic illness and progressive disease can transform an individual. His political legacy, the separation of England from Rome and the institution of the Anglican Church, continue to shape the modern world. But his personal end serves as a reminder of human fragility. The last moments of Henry's life, with his suffering body and deformed face, contrast dramatically with the official portraits that show him in all his majesty. This dissonance between public image and private reality is one of the great lessons of his life and death. Thus ends the existence of one of the most famous monarchs in history, not with glory, but with unbearable pain and an undeserved loss of dignity. The man who transformed England and altered the course of Western history ended, like all mortals, victim of the inevitable deterioration of the flesh. The death of Henry VIII was not only a historical event, but also a symbolic moment that reflects on the ephemeral nature of power. In his last years, while the body of the king deteriorated, so too deteriorated the myth of royal invulnerability. The monarchy, a divine institution that was considered above the laws of nature, was forced to recognize its own mortality. The final irony in the life of Henry VIII is that the man who had committed himself so intensely to guarantee a male heir, to the point of breaking with Rome and executing 2 wives, produced a fragile son who would die young. His real legacy would pass through his daughters, particularly Elizabeth I, the daughter of the woman he had executed under false accusations. Perhaps the most profound lesson in the death of Henry VIII is that even absolute power cannot defeat the limits of the human body. The man who rewrote the laws of his nation to satisfy his desires could not rewrite the laws of nature. In the end, even the most powerful of kings faces the same fate as the most humble of subjects. The death of Henry VIII is not only a story of medical horror, but a moral tale about the limits of human power and the inevitability of physical deterioration. His body, once admired as the incarnation of royalty, became a symbol of the transitory nature of every earthly glory. This narrative reminds us that, in the end, we are all equal before death, regardless of our accomplishments or social position. The terrible death of Henry VIII continues to fascinate and terrify precisely because it reveals the vulnerable humanity behind the facade of absolute power. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Share with those who love history. Thank you for listening. See you next time.